The sound of the china breaking echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. Carlos stood still, his eyes fixed on the porcelain shards scattered across the kitchen floor, the remnants of the dinner set that Helena, his late wife, had cherished so much. His hands trembled violently, and a stain of coffee spread across the floor like a silent accusation of his growing helplessness. "Dad? What was that?" Roberto's voice came from a distance, followed by the familiar sound of a chair scraping and hurried footsteps. Carlos didn't answer right away. At 72, each new day seemed to bring a new humiliation, another reminder that he was becoming exactly what he had always feared, a burden. "It's nothing," he tried to say, but his voice came out shaky and weak. "I just dropped it." Marina, his daughter-in-law, arrived first in the kitchen, still in her bathrobe. Her eyes widened at the sight of the mess, and Carlos noticed the exact moment when she tried to hide her frustration behind a mask of concern. "Mr. Carlos, are you all right? Don't move, there are shards everywhere." Roberto appeared right after, still adjusting his tie, always in a hurry. "Dad, what happened? Are you hurt?" Carlos began, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain that his hands simply no longer obeyed him? That the trembling was getting worse each day? That the cup had slipped from his fingers like water? "Let me clean it up," Marina said quickly, already reaching for the broom. "Roberto, you're going to be late for your meeting." "But Dad?" "Go ahead, son," Carlos interrupted, forcing a smile. "Your meeting is important." Roberto hesitated for a moment, torn between professional duty and filial concern. Finally he glanced at his watch and nodded. "Marina, you?" Yes, I'll take care of everything," she replied, already starting to sweep up the shards. Carlos watched his son leave in a hurry as always. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the apartment like a sentence. He stood there, feeling invisible while Marina cleaned up his mess, murmuring words of comfort that sounded hollow. The scene that morning was just another chapter in a story that had been unfolding for months, ever since his health had started visibly declining. Carlos could sense the exchanged glances between his son and daughter-in-law, the whispers when they thought he couldn't hear, the subtle changes in the household routine. Later, alone in his room, the one he had once shared with Helena, Carlos sat in his favorite armchair, the one that still held the scent of his wife on the dampest days. The walls around him were adorned with photographs that told the story of an entire life. His marriage to Helena, Roberto's birth, graduations, birthdays, moments of joy frozen in time. His eyes lingered on one photo in particular, he and Helena on the day Roberto graduated from college. They were radiant with pride, and Carlos remembered exactly how he had felt that day, strong, capable, needed. Now, 15 years later, he felt like a shadow of that man. The sound of the television in the living room reached his bedroom muffled. Marina was watching her morning soap operas, as she always did after finishing the household chores. Carlos could occasionally hear her laughter or small exclamations of surprise at the plot. It was a constant reminder of how she had her own life, her own interests, and how he was just an additional complication in her routine. He picked up the photo frame and ran his trembling fingers over Helena's smiling face. "What would you do in my place, my love?" he whispered to the photograph. "How would you handle all of this?" The silence that followed his question was broken by a soft knock on the door. Marina entered, carrying a tray with his lunch, always punctual, always fulfilling her duty. "I brought your lunch, Mr. Carlos," she said, placing the tray on the small table next to the armchair. "Do you need anything else?" Carlos looked at the tray: rice, beans, a piece of grilled chicken and cooked vegetables. All perfectly suitable for an elderly man. All tasteless, soulless, without the special seasoning Helena used to add. "No thank you, Marina," he replied automatically as he always did. She nodded and turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Mr. Carlos, about this morning? Don't worry about the cup, okay? Accidents happen." The kindness in her voice only made Carlos feel worse. "That dinner set was Helena's," he said softly. "It was her favorite." Marina hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Well, it's just material things, right? The important thing is that you didn't get hurt." After she left, Carlos pushed the tray away, no longer hungry. Marina's words, though well-intentioned, had touched something deep inside him. Just material things, as if the memories that dinner set carried could simply be swept away along with the shards. At night, lying in his bed that seemed too large for one man, Carlos couldn't sleep. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the city outside. He could hear Roberto arriving late as always, his careful footsteps in the hallway, trying not to make a sound. It was at that moment, surrounded by darkness and silence, that Carlos made his decision. He couldn't go on like this, being a shadow in his son and daughter-in-law's lives, a burden they carried out of obligation. The idea of a nursing home, which once seemed like a nightmare, was now beginning to take shape as a solution. The next morning, when Roberto hurried past his bedroom door, Carlos called him with a voice he hadn't used in a long time, the voice of the retired professor who used to command entire classrooms. "Roberto, we need to talk." His son stopped, surprised by the firmness in his voice. "Sure, Dad. Just let me." "Now," Carlos interrupted, and there was something in his tone that left no room for argument. Roberto hesitated and then stepped into the room, as if treading on unfamiliar ground. Marina, hearing the voices, appeared at the door, curious. "I've made a decision," Carlos began, his hands gripping the arms of the armchair to control the trembling. "I can't keep being a burden to you. I want to go to a nursing home." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Marina brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, while Roberto stood frozen, as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Dad." Roberto started, but Carlos raised a trembling hand to silence him. "Don't try to talk me out of it," he said, his voice now softer but still resolute. "I see how hard it is for you. The sighs, the worried glances, the changed routines. You're young, you have your lives, your jobs. I understand. And I don't want to be a burden anymore." Then something unexpected happened. Roberto, always so composed, so professional, let out a sob. A broken, visceral sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. In 2 steps, he was kneeling before his father's armchair, just as he hadn't done since he was a child. "No, Dad," he said, his voice choked. "Please don't do this. I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry." The tears Carlos had held back all day finally found their freedom, silently trickling down his wrinkled face. It was the first time in years that he saw his son show such emotion, and that moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would forever change the dynamics of this family. The next morning, the apartment was immersed in a different kind of silence. Roberto's crying had left invisible marks on the air, as if the walls still echoed that moment of shared vulnerability. Carlos woke up before dawn, his joints protesting against the mattress that no longer offered the comfort of other times. Marina broke her usual routine that morning. Instead of simply placing the coffee tray and leaving, she sat on the edge of Carlos's bed, something she hadn't done in months. Her hands held a cup of tea she had made herself, and her face showed signs of a sleepless night. "Mr. Carlos," she began hesitantly, "about yesterday, do you really want to go to a nursing home?" Carlos watched the steam rise from the cup in delicate spirals before replying. "Marina, you're a good girl. You've always taken care of me even when you didn't have to. But I see the weight this puts on your shoulders." "It's not a burden," she quickly protested, but her voice trembled slightly. "It is," he replied softly. "And that's okay. You and Roberto deserve to live your lives without worrying about me every minute." Marina placed the cup on the nightstand and, in a surprising gesture, took Carlos's trembling hands in hers. "Do you remember the day of my wedding to Roberto?" Carlos nodded, a little confused by the sudden change in topic. How could he forget? Helena was still alive, and the 4 of them had danced together at the party, laughing and celebrating as if time were endless. "You called me your daughter for the first time that day," Marina continued, her words heavy with emotion. "And Mrs. Helena hugged me and said she finally had the daughter she always wanted. You gave me a family when my own had abandoned me." Marina's words hit Carlos like a punch in the stomach. It was true, she had come into their lives as an unexpected gift, bringing light and joy to their small family. How had he forgotten that? "Roberto is destroyed," she went on. "He spent the whole night in the office looking at old photos. I found him crying in the middle of the night, going through an album from when he was a child." Carlos felt his heart tighten. Roberto, his son, always so strong and determined, crying because of him? The image was almost unbearable. At that moment, they heard the apartment door open. It was an unusual sound at this hour of the morning. Roberto would normally have already left for work. Heavy footsteps approached the room, and soon his son appeared in the doorway, still wearing the clothes from the previous day, deep dark circles under his eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse, "I took the day off today. We need to talk. Really talk." Carlos felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time Roberto had voluntarily taken a day off work. His son was known for his almost obsessive dedication to his career, even participating in meetings by phone when he had a high fever. Roberto pulled the chair from the desk and sat down, running his hands over his tired face. "Dad, last night after you talked about the nursing home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times you and Mom were there for me without hesitation, without question. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I remembered when I broke my arm at 12 playing soccer. You sat by my bed all night, telling me stories to distract me from the pain. And when I failed calculus in college, Mom made that giant chocolate cake and you both stayed with me planning how I could recover the grade. Marina quietly stood up and left the room, sensing that father and son needed this moment alone. Carlos watched his son, noticing for the first time the gray strands beginning to show at his temples. The truth is, Dad, Roberto continued, his voice thick with emotion, I failed you. I got so lost in work, in the pursuit of success and recognition, that I forgot what really matters. And now, when you need me most, I've been so absent that I made you think you were a burden. Son? Carlos tried to interrupt, but Roberto raised his hand. Let me finish, please. Last night, while I was looking at old photos, I found one Mom had kept. It was from my high school graduation day, remember? You had just recovered from that bad pneumonia, but you insisted on coming to the ceremony, even though the doctor told you not to. Carlos remembered it well. He had spent 2 weeks in the hospital, but nothing in the world would stop him from seeing his only son receive his diploma. Helena had been furious with his stubbornness, but in the end, even she admitted it was worth it. You've always been there for me, Dad. Always. And now, when it's my turn to give back, I've been failing miserably. Roberto stood up and walked over to the window, gazing out at the city beginning to wake. But that's going to change. Today, I'm going to reorganize my work schedule. No more weekend meetings, no more coming home after everyone's already asleep. Carlos felt the tears beginning to form in his eyes. Son, you don't need to. I do, Roberto interrupted, turning to face his father. And I want to. You taught me that family comes first, always. I just let myself forget that for far too long. It was then that Marina chose to return to the room, carrying a tray with fresh coffee and homemade cookies, Carlos's favorites, which she hadn't made in months. And it's not just that, she added, setting the tray on the bedside table. I've been thinking. Why don't we turn the office into a more comfortable space for you? We could put your favorite chair there, set up a little library. A place where you can read, watch TV, receive visitors. Carlos looked at the two of them, his heart overflowing with emotion. His son, always so busy and distant, promising change. His daughter-in-law, offering not just practical care, but true affection. It was more than he expected, more than he had ever dreamed of in those long, lonely nights. I don't want to be a burden, he whispered, his voice trembling. I don't want you to feel obligated. Dad, Roberto interrupted, kneeling again beside the bed, you've never been and will never be a burden. It's I who have been too heavy with other things to see what really matters. Will you forgive me? And there, in that room bathed in the soft morning light, something began to change. It wasn't just a promise of a physical transformation in the environment, but a deeper, more meaningful change. It was as though the invisible walls that had slowly risen between them over the years began to slowly crumble. The promises made that morning began to materialize in the following days. Roberto, keeping his word, rearranged his work schedule. The transformation wasn't easy. His superiors didn't take well to the news that he wouldn't be available 24 hours a day anymore, and some colleagues made sarcastic comments about his new priorities. Are you sure about this, son? Carlos asked one night, after hearing Roberto arguing on the phone with his boss. I don't want you to ruin your career because of me. Roberto, who was helping his father organize old photographs on the new shelf in the renovated office, paused his work. Do you know what the last thing Mom told me before she left? He picked up a photo where Helena was smiling brightly, hugging Carlos. She said, take care of your father, my son. He's more fragile than he seems. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. The silence that followed was filled only by the soft hum of the fan and the clinking of picture frames being arranged. Carlos watched his son, noticing how his shoulders seemed lighter, despite the new pressures at work. The office renovation had become a family project. Marina spent several weekends choosing wall colors that would match the old furniture that Carlos cherished so much. The walls, once an impersonal beige, now displayed a soft shade of blue that reminded one of the sky on autumn days. However, not everything was perfect. One particularly difficult afternoon, while Carlos was trying to get a glass of water in the kitchen, his hands trembled more than usual. The glass slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor and spilling water everywhere. Marina, who was preparing dinner, couldn't hold back a sigh of frustration. I'm sorry, Carlos muttered, feeling once again useless and clumsy. No, Mr. Carlos, I'm the one who's sorry, Marina quickly replied, but there was a tension in her voice that didn't go unnoticed. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. The little radio in the kitchen, always on while Marina cooked, began to play an old song, Karen Hosod by Pixinguinha. It was Helena's favorite song, the one she and Carlos danced to at their silver wedding anniversary. Carlos closed his eyes, letting the melody envelop him. Without thinking, he began to hum softly, his fingers gently tapping on his cane. Marina, who had bent down to clean the water, stopped and looked at her father-in-law in surprise. "You sing really well," she exclaimed, genuinely impressed. "Ah," Carlos smiled sadly, "Helena and I used to dance to this song a lot. She used to say I had a crooner's voice." Marina stood up, leaving the rag behind, and did something completely unexpected. She reached out her hand to Carlos, inviting him to dance. "Marina, no. My legs. Just a little bit," she insisted with a gentle smile. "We can dance really slowly." And so, in the middle of the kitchen, with water still on the floor and dinner forgotten on the stove, father-in-law and daughter-in-law danced. It was a hesitant, careful dance, but there was something profoundly meaningful in that shared moment. Roberto arrived home just then, stopping at the kitchen door with an expression of surprise that quickly turned into an emotional smile. He took his phone out of his pocket and discreetly began filming the scene. But life has a peculiar way of balancing moments of joy with challenges. The following week, during a routine checkup, Carlos's doctor expressed concern about the worsening of his tremors. "We need to do some more detailed tests," Dr. Peterson explained, adjusting his glasses as he examined the notes. The tremors could be a symptom of something more serious. Roberto, who had made a point of accompanying his father to the appointment, felt his heart tighten. "More serious like what, doctor?" "Well," the doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "there's a possibility we're dealing with the onset of Parkinson's. But let's not jump to conclusions. First, we'll do all the necessary tests." The drive back home was silent. Carlos stared out the car window, watching the city pass by in colorful blurs, while Roberto gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "It's going to be okay, Dad," Roberto said finally, his voice betraying the worry he was trying to hide. Carlos simply nodded, lost in his thoughts. The word Parkinson echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. He remembered his own father, who had faced the same disease years ago. He remembered how painful it was to watch that strong, vibrant man slowly be consumed by the illness. When they arrived home, Marina was waiting for them with lunch ready. She had made feijoada, Carlos's favorite dish. The familiar aroma filled the apartment, but for the first time in a long time, Carlos didn't feel hungry. "How was the appointment?" Marina asked, serving the plates. Roberto opened his mouth to answer, but Carlos interrupted him. "The doctor wants to run some tests," he said simply, picking up his utensils with hands that seemed to tremble even more now. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken worries. Marina and Roberto exchanged meaningful glances over the table, while Carlos stirred his food on the plate without actually eating. It was then that something inside him broke. The spoon slipped from his fingers, falling onto the table with a metallic clink, and before he could regain control, tears began to stream down his face. "Dad," Roberto started, but Carlos raised his hand, asking for silence. "You don't understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw what this disease did to my father. I saw how he suffered, how he became dependent on everyone for everything. I don't want that for you. I don't want to become an even bigger burden." Marina suddenly stood up from her chair and, to everyone's surprise, hugged Carlos tightly. "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "You're family. And family takes care of each other no matter what happens." Roberto joined the embrace, and for a moment the three of them stayed like that, united not just by love, but by the determination to face whatever the future might hold together. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Carlos sat in his armchair in the newly renovated office. The blue walls seemed to absorb the soft light from the lamp, creating a cozy atmosphere. He picked up one of the photographs from the shelf, he and Helena on the day Roberto was born. "Oh, my love," he whispered to the smiling image of his wife, "how I miss you in these moments." The diagnosis hadn't been confirmed yet, but fear had already settled in his heart. Still, something had changed. The idea of a nursing home, which had once seemed like the only solution, now felt like giving up. Perhaps, Carlos thought, true courage wasn't in leaving so as not to be a burden, but in staying and allowing his loved ones to love and care for him, even in his most vulnerable moments. The following weeks turned into a marathon of medical exams. Carlos underwent an endless series of neurological tests, MRIs, and clinical evaluations. Each visit to the hospital seemed to drain a little more of his energy, but it also revealed something surprising. the renewed strength of his family bonds. São Francisco Hospital, with its endless hallways and pastel-colored walls, became a second home for the family. The reception staff already knew Carlos by name, and Nurse Clara, a gray-haired lady with a gentle smile, always saved the latest magazines for him in the waiting room. Roberto completely rearranged his work schedule, delegating responsibilities he had once considered essential. "I have flexible hours accumulated over the years," he explained when his boss, a man with thick eyebrows and a difficult temper, questioned his frequent absences. "And I intend to use them now." "You were our most dedicated employee, Roberto," the boss argued, drumming his fingers on the mahogany desk. "Now you hardly attend important meetings?" "Exactly," Roberto replied, keeping his voice steady. "I used to be. Because I realized there are things more important than reports and spreadsheets. My father needs me now." The conversation cost Roberto a promotion that was practically guaranteed, but when he told Carlos about it during one of their family lunches, his smile was genuine. "You know, Dad, for the first time in years I feel like I'm doing the right thing." Marina, on the other hand, developed an elaborate system to help Carlos with his medications and appointments. She bought a large calendar with large, easy-to-read letters and hung it on the wall of the renovated office. Every consultation, every test, every medication time was marked in different colors. Blue for appointments, green for medications, yellow for physical therapy, she explained patiently as she showed the system to Carlos. And red for special moments, when we're having family activities. The calendar quickly became more than just an organizer. It was a visual testament to the love and dedication Marina devoted to her father-in-law. She spent hours researching Carlos's potential condition, joining online support groups, and talking to other family caregivers. One morning, while waiting in the neurologist's office, Carlos observed an elderly man in a wheelchair, being pushed by a caregiver with a bored expression. The man was trying to say something, but his words came out garbled, incomprehensible. The caregiver merely nodded absent-mindedly, more interested in her phone than in the elderly man's attempts to communicate. "I don't want that," Carlos murmured to Roberto, who was holding his hand. "I don't want to become just another job for someone." Roberto gently squeezed his father's hand. "That will never happen. We're different, Dad. We're family." That day's consultation was particularly difficult. Dr. Peterson, a middle-aged neurologist with kind eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, examined the latest results with a focused expression. "The tremors are increasing in frequency," he observed, showing some charts on his computer. "And I noticed some muscle rigidity during the physical exam." Carlos felt his heart race. Beside him, Roberto leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "What does this mean exactly, doctor?" Roberto asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he was trying to hide. "It's still too early for a definitive diagnosis," the doctor replied, choosing his words carefully. "But we need to start considering some preventive treatment options." On the way back home they stopped at a bakery. It was a small, cozy place, with little iron tables on the sidewalk and the irresistible aroma of fresh bread in the air. Roberto ordered 2 coffees and a generous slice of apple pie to share with his father. "Remember when I was little and we used to come here for coffee after your classes?" Roberto asked, sipping his coffee with a nostalgic smile. Carlos nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he held the cup. "Your mom always complained that I was feeding you too many sweets. But she ended up coming with us most of the time," Roberto laughed. "And ate more sweets than both of us combined." The moment was interrupted when Carlos tried to bring the cup to his lips and spilled some coffee on his shirt. Immediately, his face twisted into an expression of frustration and embarrassment. Without hesitation, Roberto grabbed a napkin and helped his father clean up. "You know what we could do? Buy some of those special mugs with lids. I saw some really cool ones the other day. They look like regular cups, but they're safer. You don't need to worry. It's no trouble, Dad. It's adaptation. Everyone needs to adapt at some point in life." When they arrived home, they found Marina busy in the kitchen. The delicious smell of something baking in the oven filled the air. She was trying to replicate an old recipe of Helena's, that cornbread cake with guava paste that Carlos loved so much. "I found Mrs. Helena's recipe book hidden at the back of the cupboard," she explained, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought I'd try making some of your favorite recipes." The recipe book was yellowed with age, its pages stained with ingredients and memories. Helena's delicate handwriting filled each page, not just with culinary instructions, but with little notes and personal observations. "Add more sugar when Carlos is feeling sad," one note read next to the cornbread cake recipe. "Roberto loves the extra creamy topping," another said. Marina had spent the entire morning trying to decipher the handwritten measurements, some of them already faded with time. There was something deeply intimate about preparing a recipe that carried so many family memories. Carlos sat at the kitchen table watching Marina work. There was something of Helena in her at that moment. Not in her appearance, but in the careful way she measured the ingredients, in the way she hummed softly while stirring the batter. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "Helena always said the kitchen was the heart of the house. It was where people gathered, talked, shared their lives." Marina stopped what she was doing and sat down beside her father-in-law. She was right. "And that's why I make sure we have family lunches and dinners, even when everyone's busy." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the oven timer. The cake was ready, and its aroma filled the kitchen with sweet memories. When Marina took it out of the oven, it wasn't exactly like Helena used to make it. It was a bit darker at the edges, and the guava paste had sunk a little more than usual. "I'm sorry," she said, looking critically at the cake. "I don't think it turned out the same." "No," Carlos replied with a gentle smile. "It turned out your way. And it's perfect just like this." That evening during dinner, Carlos watched his small family. Roberto, still in his work suit but with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, was enthusiastically talking about a new project. Marina laughed at his imitations of his co-workers while serving another helping of salad on her husband's plate. Dinner stretched on for hours, something that hadn't happened in a long time. They talked about everything and nothing, shared old stories and made plans for the future. Carlos told stories from his years as a teacher, stories Roberto already knew but Marina listened to with genuine interest. "Remember that student who was always late, Dad?" Roberto asked between laughs. "What was his name again?" "Miguel," Carlos replied, his eyes lighting up with the memory. "The guy who later became the school principal. He always said my scoldings helped him become more responsible." It was a common scene, even ordinary, but for Carlos, it carried deep meaning. It wasn't just dinner, it was a living proof that, despite all the difficulties, despite the looming possibility of a frightening diagnosis hanging over their heads, there was still room for genuine moments of joy. Later, in his bedroom, Carlos picked up the picture frame with Helena's photo that he kept on the nightstand. "You'd be proud of them, my love," he whispered to the smiling image of his wife. "Our son, our daughter-in-law, they're much stronger than I ever imagined." And for the first time in a long time, when Carlos lay down to sleep, it wasn't with a weight on his heart. Yes, there was fear of the future, worry about what the tests might reveal. But there was also a growing certainty that, no matter what happened, he wouldn't be alone. His family was there, not out of obligation or duty, but out of love, a love that revealed itself in the small gestures, the daily adaptations, the recreated recipes, and the shared stories. The day of the diagnosis arrived with an unusually cold morning for the season. Carlos woke up before the alarm, his hands trembling more than usual, perhaps due to the anxiety of what was to come. He watched through the window as the fog covered the city, creating a scene that seemed to reflect the uncertainty in his heart. Marina was already in the kitchen when he left the bedroom, preparing a special breakfast. The aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a clear attempt to bring some comfort to that tense morning. "I made that cheese bread you like," she said, placing a steaming basket on the table. "And there's fresh orange juice too." Carlos smiled, touched by the gesture, but his stomach was too knotted to eat. His hands trembled so much that he could barely hold the coffee cup, spilling a bit onto the tablecloth. "I'm sorry," he murmured, frustrated by his own incapacity. "It's okay," Marina responded softly, wiping up the spilled coffee. "Roberto is already getting ready. He insisted on rescheduling all his meetings for today." The drive to Dr. Peterson's office was silent. Roberto drove with extra care, as if trying to prolong the journey, delay the inevitable. Carlos watched the city pass by the car window, thinking about how a diagnosis could change everything, or perhaps just confirm what he had already suspected. In the waiting room, the tension was palpable. Roberto absent-mindedly flipped through an old magazine, not really reading anything, while Marina held Carlos's hand, offering silent support. The clock on the wall seemed to move with excruciating slowness. When they were finally called in, Dr. Peterson greeted them with his usual professional cordiality, but there was something different in his eyes, a seriousness that made Carlos's heart tighten. "Well, Mr. Carlos," the doctor began, adjusting his glasses as he organized a stack of tests on his desk. "I've reviewed all of your results and..." It was at this moment that something entirely unexpected happened. Before the doctor could continue, Roberto stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. "Before you continue, I need to say something." He turned to Carlos, his eyes misty. Dad, whatever the diagnosis is, nothing will change. Nothing. Do you understand? The room fell into absolute silence. Even Dr. Peterson seemed taken aback by the emotional interruption. Marina brought her hands to her face, trying to hold back the tears that were beginning to fall. Son? Carlos began, but Roberto continued. No, Dad, let me finish, Roberto insisted, his voice heavy with emotion. I spent the whole night thinking about this. Do you remember when I was 10 and broke my arm? You didn't leave my side for a second in the hospital. When I failed in college, you and Mom supported me unconditionally. Now it's my turn to repay all that love. Dr. Peterson waited respectfully for Roberto to finish before clearing his throat softly. Mr. Carlos, he began again, the tests confirmed our initial suspicion. You are in the early stages of Parkinson's disease. The words fell like stones in the silent room. Carlos closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the diagnosis on his shoulders. But before he could give in to despair, he felt Roberto's strong hands on his shoulders and Marina's delicate fingers entwined with his. The good news, the doctor continued, is that we detected it early. With proper treatment and family support, many patients maintain a good quality of life for years. What are the next steps, doctor? Marina asked, her voice steady despite the tears. The doctor began outlining the treatment plan. Medications, physiotherapy, specific exercises. He spoke about necessary home adaptations, the importance of psychological support. Roberto took meticulous notes on his phone, asking relevant questions about every aspect of the treatment. But Carlos barely heard him. His mind had drifted back in time to a scene from his childhood. His own father, diagnosed with the same disease, had deteriorated rapidly, not from Parkinson's itself, but from the depression that consumed him after the diagnosis. He had isolated himself, refused help, given up on life. Dad? Roberto's voice brought him back to the present. Are you listening? Carlos blinked, returning to the reality of the doctor's office. Sorry, Mr. Carlos, Dr. Peterson gently interjected. I know this is a lot to process right now. But I need you to understand something important. Today's Parkinson's is not the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago. We have much more effective treatments, more therapeutic options. That was when something extraordinary happened. Marina, who was usually more reserved in showing affection, stood up and embraced Carlos tightly. You know what we're going to do, she said, her voice filled with surprising determination. We're going to make this our family mission. Every tremor, every challenge, we'll face it together. And we're going to do more than just cope with the disease, we're going to live, Mr. Carlos. Live every moment. Roberto joined the embrace, and for a moment, there in that doctor's office, a circle of love and protection formed around Carlos. Dr. Peterson watched the scene with a discreet smile, as if he knew this was a pivotal moment in the healing process. On the way back home, they stopped at a diner. It was a simple place with formica tables and laminated menus, but it was full of life and activity. Roberto insisted on ordering milkshakes for everyone just like they did when he was a child. Do you remember when we used to come here after your math lessons? He asked, stirring his straw in his cup. You always said that a milkshake was the best medicine for tough days. Carlos smiled, recalling those moments. Your mom used to get mad because you'd come home not hungry for dinner. But she ended up coming with us most of the time, Marina added, already familiar with the family stories. The moment was interrupted when Carlos tried to grab his cup and knocked it over, spilling milkshake all over the table. His first instinct was to feel embarrassed and frustrated, but before he could apologize, Roberto was already cleaning the table while laughing. You know what this means? He said, a mischievous gleam in his eyes. We're going to have to order another one. And this time we'll use a double straw just like we used to. Marina watched the scene with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. It was as if she was witnessing something precious, a son turning a potentially traumatic moment into a sweet memory. That night, after Roberto and Marina went to bed, Carlos stayed awake in his renovated office. The blue walls, chosen with so much care by Marina, seemed to embrace him in the silence of the night. He picked up one of the photos from the shelf, him and Helena on the day Roberto was born. Oh, my love, he whispered to the picture of his wife. How proud you would be of our boy, of the family he's built. His hands trembled more than usual as he held the picture frame, but for the first time since the tremors had started, he didn't feel shame or fear. Instead, he felt a strange peace. The diagnosis, which should have been a devastating blow, had turned into a testament to the power of family love. He took an old notebook from the drawer, the one where he used to make notes when he was still teaching. With trembling but determined handwriting, he began to write. Dear Helena, today I received a diagnosis that should have destroyed me. But something incredible happened. Our son, that little boy we raised with so much love, showed me a strength I didn't know he had. And Marina, she's not just our daughter-in-law, she's truly our daughter. I remember when you left 3 years ago and I thought I would never find a reason to smile again. But you left behind such a huge legacy of love that it continues to multiply, even in your absence. I have Parkinson's, my love. The same as my father. But I promise you that my story will be different. I won't hide. I won't give up. I'll fight not just for myself but for this wonderful family we built together. Tears fell silently as he wrote, staining the paper, but Carlos didn't mind. Every trembling word was a testament to his determination to face whatever was ahead. When he finally went to bed, the first light of morning was already beginning to appear on the horizon. But instead of the crushing weight he had expected to feel after the diagnosis, Carlos felt something different. Hope. A hope born not only from the love of his family but from the certainty that even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found. The months that followed the diagnosis brought a new routine for the family. The apartment underwent small but significant changes. Handrails were installed in the hallways, slip-resistant rugs replaced the decorative ones, and the kitchen counter was outfitted with adaptive utensils that Marina tirelessly researched online. On one particularly challenging morning, Carlos struggled with his new medication routine. His hands trembled so much that the pills slipped from his fingers, scattering across the bathroom floor like colorful confetti. "Damn it!" Carlos exclaimed, frustration evident in his trembling voice. Marina, who was walking down the hallway at that moment, heard the commotion and rushed to help. She found Carlos sitting on the edge of the bathtub, head down, trying to control the tears of anger. "Let me help," Marina said gently, beginning to collect the pills. "No," Carlos responded with a firmness that surprised them both. "I need to learn to do this on my own. I can't depend on you for everything." Marina paused, watching her father-in-law with a mixture of concern and admiration. Instead of insisting on helping, she sat next to him on the edge of the bathtub. "You know, Mr. Carlos," she began, her voice calm, "when my mother abandoned me as a child, I learned that needing help doesn't make us weak. What weakens us is refusing to accept the love that's offered to us." Carlos lifted his eyes, surprised. In all these years, Marina had never spoken about her family's past. The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of morning traffic. "How did you overcome it?" he finally asked. "I found a new family," she replied with a soft smile. "You, Mrs. Helena Roberto? You showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's a choice. And every day I choose you." In that moment, something shifted in Carlos's perspective. He watched as Marina patiently collected the pills, organizing them into small groups by color and time. She wasn't just helping, she was sharing a part of herself, a vulnerability that few knew. The weeks turned into months and the family's routine found a new rhythm. Roberto kept his promise to rearrange his work schedule, coming home earlier and dedicating weekends entirely to the family. The home office, once a symbol of his absence, became a shared space where father and son spent hours talking about everything and nothing. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, Roberto found a time-worn, yellowed image. Himself at 5 years old, dressed as a superhero with Carlos by his side wearing a makeshift cape made from a tablecloth. "Do you remember this day?" Roberto asked, showing the photo to his father. "How could I forget?" Carlos replied, his hands trembling slightly as he held the photograph. "You were convinced you could fly. Your mother nearly had a heart attack when she found you at the top of the stairs, ready to take off. And you, instead of scolding me, put on a cape too and taught me that real superheroes keep their feet on the ground and help others." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. It was Clara, the physical therapist who came 3 times a week. But today there was something different in her expression, a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Mr. Carlos," she began while organizing her equipment, "I brought something new today. It's a new device we're testing with Parkinson's patients. It helps control tremors during specific activities." The device looked like a futuristic glove with tiny sensors and delicate wires. Clara explained that it worked by stimulating certain muscles, aiding in precise movements. "Would you like to try it?" she asked, extending the device. Carlos hesitated. He had tried so many treatments, so many therapies. But Roberto's hopeful gaze made him reconsider. With Clara's help, he put on the device. The first few minutes felt strange. The sensation of electrical impulses was uncomfortable, almost irritating. But then, something extraordinary happened. "Try to grab that pen," Clara suggested, pointing to a regular pen on the table. Carlos reached out, expecting the usual tremor. To his surprise, he managed to hold the pen with a steadiness he hadn't felt in months. Tears began to stream down his face as he realized he could write, not perfectly but legibly. "Dad, this is incredible," Roberto exclaimed, his voice choked with emotion. But the real surprise was yet to come. Carlos, with a mysterious smile, asked for paper and began to write something. His movements were slow, calculated, but determined. "What are you writing?" Marina asked, curious. "A letter," he replied simply. "For both of you." Silence filled the room as Carlos wrote, each word a small victory over the disease. When he finished, he took a deep breath and began to read. "My dear ones, a few months ago I thought I was becoming a burden to you. I thought the best solution was to distance myself, to hide away in a nursing home. Today I realize I was completely wrong. You not only helped me face the diagnosis, you taught me a new way of loving. Marina, you brought light to our family when we needed it most. Roberto, my son, you became the man I always knew you would be. Parkinson's may control my movements, but it cannot control the love I feel for you. And now I understand that I am not a burden, I am part of something greater. I am part of this family we choose to be every day. With eternal love. Dad/your Carlos." When he finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Roberto hugged his father tightly, while Marina sobbed quietly. Even Clara, the physical therapist, was wiping away tears. It was at that moment that the doorbell rang again. Marina went to answer and returned with a surprised expression, followed by a group of people Carlos immediately recognized, his former students, now adults, some with gray hair. "Professor Carlos," said Miguel, the same student who was always late and who was now the school principal, "we heard about your diagnosis and wanted to show our support. You changed our lives with your lessons, your patience, your love for teaching. Now it's our turn to give back." One by one, the former students began sharing stories of how Carlos had impacted their lives. Stories of when he stayed after class to help those who struggled, how he never gave up on any student, how his example inspired them to become better people. And there, surrounded by so many expressions of love, from his family, his former students, even from professionals like Clara who had become part of his journey, Carlos finally understood the deepest truth. He was not a burden, never had been. He was a link in a chain of love and gratitude that extended far beyond what he could imagine. A year had passed since that emotional afternoon when Carlos' former students appeared at his door. The apartment, once silent and heavy with melancholy, now pulsed with a different energy. The physical adaptations to assist Carlos in his routine had become a natural part of the decor, each one telling its own story of love and care. The renovated office in particular had turned into a true sanctuary. The blue walls Marina had chosen with so much care now displayed not only the old family photographs but also a growing collection of new moments. Carlos using the tremor control device for the first time, the surprise reunion with his former students, small daily victories that deserved to be celebrated. On a Sunday morning, the family gathered for a special breakfast. Marina had prepared all of Carlos' favorite recipes, including the cornbread with guava paste that now turned out just as well as Helena used to make. Roberto, who had finally found balance between work and family, was helping set the table with the same dedication he once reserved only for his corporate meetings. "I have a surprise for you," Carlos announced, his hands trembling slightly as he held an old folder. "What is it, Dad?" Roberto asked, curious. "I found something your mother kept," Carlos replied, carefully opening the folder. "These are letters she wrote for each important moment in our lives. She never gave them to us but left instructions for them to be read at the right time." Marina and Roberto moved closer, emotional, as Carlos took out 3 yellowed envelopes from the folder. With the help of the tremor control device, which he now used with ease, he began reading the first letter. "My beloved family. If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer with you physically, but my love remains alive in each of you. Carlos, my love, you've always been stronger than you think. Roberto, our precious boy, never forget that true wealth lies in the moments we share with those we love. And Marina, the daughter fate gifted us, keep being the light that illuminates our family." Helena's words echoed through the room as Carlos continued reading, his voice thick with emotion. The letter went on with advice and specific memories for each of them, as if Helena had foreseen exactly what they would need at that moment. "Carlos," the letter continued, "I know you'll face difficult moments after I'm gone. You'll want to close yourself off, isolate yourself, maybe even think you're a burden to our children. But remember, you've been the pillar of our family for so many years, and now it's time to let them be your support." Marina wiped her tears silently, while Roberto hugged his father's shoulders. Helena's wisdom, even years after her passing, still had the power to deeply touch their hearts. The past year had been a journey of discoveries and adaptations. Parkinson was still present, but it was no longer a frightening monster that threatened to destroy everything. It had become a part of their lives, a challenge they faced together, day after day. Roberto had been promoted at work, not despite his decision to prioritize family, but partially because of it. His boss noticed how he had become more efficient, more focused, accomplishing in 8 hours what had once taken 12. Marina started a blog about family caregiving, sharing her experiences and adapted recipes. What began as a personal project quickly grew into an online community of support for other families in similar situations. And Carlos discovered a new way to be useful. Once a week, he would go to the school where he had taught to participate in a special program with students facing learning difficulties. His hands might tremble, but his mind remained sharp, and his ability to connect with the students remained intact. "You know, Dad," Roberto said after they finished reading the letters, "Mom was right. You've always been our strength, even when you thought you were being weak." "And now," Marina added, "we are an even stronger family because we've learned to support each other." Carlos looked around the breakfast table at the faces he loved so much. Helena's photos on the walls seemed to smile in approval. The tremor in his hands was still there as always, but now he looked at it differently, not as a weakness but as part of who he was. "I never imagined," he said, "that the day I thought about going to a nursing home would be the beginning of such a special journey. And to think you thought you were a burden to us," Marina smiled, pouring more coffee into his adapted cup. "When, in reality," Roberto added, "you taught us the true definition of family." The morning continued with stories and laughter, planning for the next Sunday lunch and discussions about Marina's blog. The apartment, once quiet and melancholic, was now overflowing with life and love. Carlos realized that his story wasn't just about overcoming Parkinson's or learning to accept help. It was about rediscovering the meaning of family, about understanding that true love doesn't see limitations as barriers, but as opportunities to demonstrate its strength. Helena's words in her final letter perfectly summarized this. "Love is like water, it finds its way through the smallest cracks, adapts to any shape, and has the power to soften even the hardest stones. Let it flow, my beloved family. Let it flow." And so, on that Sunday morning, surrounded by the love of his family, Carlos finally understood that he had never been a burden. He was a bridge connecting the past to the present, Helena's love to the future they were building together, day by day. Dear viewers, what did you think of this touching story? Have you ever experienced something similar with your family? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your support helps us continue bringing inspiring stories like this one. See you next time.